It's a great pleasure to be speaking to all of you today. And thank you so much for joining on a Friday evening to listen to me. We're going to talk about managing generational divides. And I think the topic is something that might be of interest to a lot of people. But we'd like to quickly know a little bit of your profile. And I'm going to put up my slides now. And we'll start off with a quick poll, which has 2 questions, just to get to know you, whoever has joined in, a little bit better before we can proceed on to our main.
Should I launch the poll, Ajay?
You'll need to give me the access rights to share my screen first, Mahesh.
Okay, no, I can launch it. Don't worry. Just mention it to me. I will share the controls.
Yeah. Okay, first I'll share my screen and looks like there's some restriction. Host disabled attendee screen sharing is what it says. So probably you need to make me a panelist or something, or a co-host. Yeah, got it.
I've already launched the poll.
No, poll is fine. Poll will go on.
Yeah.
I think it'll take some time for people to.
Yeah, we'll give some time to people. There are about 35 of them. 18 of them voted, so we'll wait for the rest of them to vote. Do a quick voting, please, all the participants. A lot of connection is going to be presented by Ajay based on the responses that you're offering, and he'll connect all that he is to speak to who we are and what kind of generational slot we fall into. That's the reason why he's doing this. Right? So, there are 2 questions. Please respond to both of them.
Okay, this is surprising that there are a lot of people who are students, and
I'll end the poll.
Don't yeah, you can end the poll now.
And I'll share the results so that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Ajay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying that this is interesting that we have a lot of students, almost 26%, 7 of them out of the 30, and yet they are not in the 2000 to 2014 age group, which is an interesting kind of thing to start off with. A lot of business professionals, self-employed professionals as well as entrepreneurs, and predominantly we have people born after 65 attending the session today. So that's great. Thank you so much. You can stop sharing this. And so let's get started with this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend some time in trying to define the various generations and their characteristics. And then we will come towards the, I think, the last third part of the presentation in terms of managing these divides. So to begin with, this naming of generations itself is something that is of interest because it's something that started in the US in the early 20th century, North American actually. And so it's a construct that is typically Western, but a lot of countries over the years have now borrowed from that construct and have started naming some of their generations according to these conventions. In terms of the first historical reference of a generation being named, it was by American poet and writer Gertrude Stein, who coined the word the lost generation for the people who had fought in the World War I. And that's something that okay, I am getting a message saying, am I audible now? Can I move on, or do you want me to speak a little louder for that?
I think a little louder will be helpful.
Okay, fair enough. I will speak a little louder and also come closer to the screen, I guess. So she was the first one to have named a generation. The rest of the generational naming has come from generational theorists Neil Howe and William Strauss, and they have actually named several of the later generations, and we'll come to some of that. The GI generation was called the greatest generation later, of course, the people who fought World War II. So this is another generational naming that is popular. Baby boomer is the only kind of name that is recognized by the US Census and is included in the official documents. And I'll talk about baby boomers in a little more detail. Canadian Douglas Copeland actually coined the term Generation X or Gen X. And we will be referring to this term a little more detail as we proceed further. Howe and Strauss coined the terms Generation Y or Millennials as well as Generation Z. And we'll talk about these two generations also. And if anyone is really interested what happens after Generation Z, there's an Australian, Mark McIntyre, who has named the latest generation as the Alpha generation. If you are interested, you can look him up and find out what the Alpha generation is. So what defines a generation? I think there are three things that are common when a generation gets defined. One, of course, is a period, a certain period of birth where everyone is born in a certain period. Then there are some life-shaping events that the people share in that particular period, which is the kind of creation of a generation. And then there are some shared values for people who are born in a certain generation. And obviously, these three have a lot of interplay and interaction with each other. But these are the three key considerations when it comes to defining a generation. So this is what the timeline of the various generations looks like. And this is something that I've picked up from the Pew Internet Research or Pew Research Foundation, which has been doing a lot of work in trying to define the timeline as far as generations are concerned. So if you look at this timeline, I think before 1928 was the greatest generation. 1928 to 45 was called the silent generation. 46 to 64 is the baby boomers. 65 to 80 is the Generation X. This has changed a little bit, but we'll come to that a little later. Millennial generation was coined between 1981 and 1995. Generation Z was born between 95 and 20. There's an interesting understanding of why we need to kind of look at this generational divides carefully. This is, of course, again, US statistic, but I think in India, it will not be very different. If you look at this, roughly about 18% of people by 2025 in the working category will be from Generation Z. And the baby boomers will probably be retiring by that time, but still there'll be at least a good 20–23% of people in the baby boomer generation. So there's a significant portion of multi-cultural, multi-generational set of employees coming together. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm speaking at the loudest kind of thing, so I can't speak.
Yeah, it could be the network at the other end, so that's fine.
Yeah, so if you still, if still persists, let me know. I'll need to check something on my side there also. But what we are saying is that this is something that is of importance, that there will be 4 generations who will be working together at least by 2025. And in order for all of us to be able to be as effective as we can be, there'll be a need to manage this generational divide. So 4 generations at workplace: baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z, or millennials and centennials. So these are the 4 generations that we are going to take a look at very quickly, and I'll rush through some of this. If you want any question at any point in time, please kind of pop in your question in the chat, and maybe I will stop and respond to that. Why is it relevant to understand this? Like I said, we are obviously managing employees across these 4 generations. And when we are trying to manage employees across 4 generations, there are also managing expectations of all these 4 sets of employees across generations. And overall, managing communication between and across these people is something that is crucial to be able to make our organization more effective. And that's why it's important for us to understand this. So before we move on, Mahesh, could you please launch poll 2? This
Yes.
poll 2 has 3 questions. You are required to respond to all these 3 questions.
Okay, I'm launching the poll.
Okay, is it difficult for people to figure out where the poll is, or?
The poll is on. I think there are many options to read through.
Sure.
Ajay, as the poll gets on its way, I'm also curious if you're going to address some of these expectations and communication aspects from not just from the workforce perspective, but also from a family perspective.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'll probably cite a couple of my own personal examples.
Awesome.
To be able to
That'd be great.
Like you said, I have a teenage or someone who's also a young adult and someone who's reaching that adolescence. So
yeah, that'll be interesting to hear.
Okay, so this is interesting.
Yeah, I'm closing the poll, please.
Yeah, you can close the poll. You can close the poll, and you can share the results.
Because there are people who still, after we said we'll close, there are 3 people who voted.
Okay.
Yeah.
So interestingly, there are at least 2 people who are listening to this webinar who know what a wall tube radio is, and I really I must kind of give you my thumbs up, because not a lot of people would know what a wall tube radio would be. My father actually, he was in the Air Force communications wing, so he actually built wall tube radios at home, and so I know what it is, and so on and so forth. But looks like transistor radio and cassette tape players were probably the earliest that people have heard music on, which is awesome. And then, of course, some of them, there's one person who looks at streaming apps. Okay, interesting. Look at this. A predominant 44% people traveled, experienced their first air travel when they were between 24 and 40 years old. And I think we will get a significant number remembering India winning the World Cup in 1983, but also I think Kargil War, and then followed by, I think, the economic liberalization. So the reason we put up this thing is these are some events or some distinctive, you can stop sharing this, Mesh. These are some events or distinctive kind of phases that we will be talking about in the 4 generations. Okay, so let's roll with baby boomers, and here are the category of people who are called baby boomers. So they are born between 46 and 64, and it's interesting why it's called baby boomer. So if you remember, 1945 was the end of World War II, and a lot of American soldiers returned from the war home, and they started families. And so in 1946, there was suddenly a big boom of babies that were born, and that's why these are called the baby boomers. It's also a generation that has seen some amount of stability in their childhood, and we will see some of that as we go forward. So many of them had to take care of themselves as kids. Because there were multiple kids in the household, parents did not have enough individual attention opportunity to take care of each kid. So usually the elder son or elder daughter in the family would have to take care of their siblings, younger siblings. Even in India, if you look at it, people born in this period would remember that they were either in large extended families, or they were probably in families that were large themselves and would have to take care of their siblings if they were the elder ones. As a result, many of them, when they grew up, they valued independence in their own kids, because they didn't want to take care of their kids anymore, because they had done enough of that. So that's something that they valued highly. And this generation, or the people in this generation, are defined by their dependability. So this is a generation you could ask something to do, and you didn't have to worry whether it would be done or not. So dependability was the cornerstone of their characteristic. Many of us, some of us at least, would have parents who were probably born in this period, and you would be able to relate to your parents' experiences or some characteristics as we move forward. Now, as I mentioned, there are some life-shaping events that happen to be able to define. So here is a look at some political, economic, social, and technology situations that might be representative. And this is the pattern that we will see for all four generations as we move forward. So like I said, post-World War II, relatively peaceful period. As far as India is concerned, this was the post-independence period. There were struggles, obviously, but to a large extent, there was some level of liberation from being under the British rule. So that was something that was common. Political independence and rise of free nations. If you look at the world history, there are a lot of countries that gained their freedom during this period, and therefore this is a period of a lot of independence, both politically as well as personally, and we'll see how that impacted. So growth of middle class and increased consumerism, particularly in the West, when people came back from the war, in order for them to kind of enjoy the life, because they realized how fragile it was, there was an increased amount of consumerism. People had started moving to suburbs. There was a lot of growth of suburbs that had happened. Even in India, people who became kind of adults at this stage were willing to move out of their small villages and small towns to probably cities where they could get a lot of employment opportunities. And to that extent, some amount of consumerism had started even in India. So like I mentioned, growth of cities and suburbs, so I'll move on. Other events during this period, events like Vietnam War, civil rights movement, as far as the West is concerned, a lot of challenges for India, which was becoming a newly independent, newly democratically republic country, and had its own challenges as to how they wanted to grow and meet the aspirations of its citizens. Some of the technologies that had already started being popular is telephone, telex, fax and mail, as in fax, and some television. So this is again predominantly Western, and we have a slight shift between when it happened in the West and when it happened in India. But even then, there were people who had telephones at this point in time. Some of them had black and white televisions, if some of you remember, which would air only a few programs, and so on and so forth. Some basic industrial automation had started. So a lot of the kind of personal hard work or personal labor was beginning to migrate to industrial automation, not necessarily the high-tech automation that we are now referring to, but some basic industrial automation, like mechanization of some of the kind of tools that people used. So long distance travel was difficult and time consuming. If you remember any of your uncles or aunts or any such elders who migrated out of India at that point in time, that would have been very, very rare. I mean, people who traveled to UK or to US or other places, Africa was at that time one of the destinations where a lot of people travel, but it was time consuming and also very, very expensive. So that's the other situation. So here are some characteristics of the baby boomer generation. This is a generation that's confident and independent in their thinking, predominantly because they were not compelled to comply with any certain requirement because they were now free. But at the same time, they were also independent in terms of their thinking because they were a little better educated. Some education in terms of matriculation had started happening. People who did matriculation were able to find some clerical jobs even in the office, even in the newly developing businesses. But there were few choices for higher study. A lot of the institutions of higher studies in India were actually being set up in this period. If you look at the IISc and the IIMs and so on and so forth, a lot of these, even in IITs for that matter, were actually getting set up during this period. So as adults, they aspired to get and retain a paying job to support the family. Because they were coming from large families, one of their important expectations when they were graduating or when they became old enough to be able to work was to get a job and support the family. I remember my father joined Air Force at the age of 18 just because he was required to support his family, which had three brothers and two sisters. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So in the middle and later careers, they build the reputation of reliability, and that's something that is a characteristic that they actually expect in others, as we will see further. This is a generation that's a little reluctant or unwilling to learn because there is this perception that they know whatever there is to know. Part of this perception may be true, but still there are things that this generation would be able to do better if they were willing to learn some of that. And we'll see some of those coming forward. So what's the working style of these people? Highly career focused, highly achievement oriented, and dedicated to the employer or to the work. They realize that this dedication is what would have retained them in that job and would get them a sustained earning. Work was something that's seen in this generation. Highly competitive because there were limited opportunities for high paying work. So a lot of people would really fight hard to be able to get these opportunities. The opportunities both in private sector as well as public sector were limited. Motivated by positions, prestige and perks. And this was something that was really important for a baby boomer to be able to get, let's say, a perk in the form of a chauffeur-driven car or a company housing. These are some of the things that they were motivated by, but at the same time, they were willing to work long to earn them. They were not in a hurry to be able to get this up. Respected authority. It started off with respect for their parents and then moved on to respect for bosses and others. And at the same time, when it came to their turn, they also expected the same level of respect when it was pertinent. Favored face-to-face interaction, believed in managing by walking around, source of getting to know them and also getting to get them work. So I think this is something that we've talked about. So that's the generation that was referred to as baby boomer. And it would be interesting to see how this generation is going to interact and engage with people from the subsequent generations. So let's take a look at the next generation, which is the Generation X. This is a generation that was born between 65 and 83. And just to kind of tell you that I'm from this generation. These were called latchkey kids, essentially because by this time, both the husband and wife in this generation, the adults in this generation, or the baby boomers, if you will, had started kind of working, and therefore a lot of time the kids were left alone and they were required to come back home from school and didn't have anyone to kind of receive them. So they would need to have a latchkey to get into their houses. At times they would have some cousins or others who would also be studying with them, and they would all come together. But oftentimes they would be on their own. So this is a generation called the latchkey kids. As adults, they became helicopter parents. And in fact, this is something that I will talk about from a personal experience in terms of things that as a parent, I would like my kids to do. There are a lot of things that one thinks from this generation that they missed out because of either lack of opportunity or because of lack of resources, and they don't want their kids to miss out on them, and therefore they are kind of overly imposing their will on the kids. It obviously has consequences, and which we'll talk about. But this is a generation that is defined by their can do it myself. So if you don't want to do it, if you don't help me, that's fine. I will do it myself. That's the kind of attitude that this generation kind of brings with them. So quickly going through the kind of political, economic, social, technology situations. I'm going to rush through this a little bit and running a little behind schedule. So emergency in India, Second Pak War. In the US, it was Reagan reforms, space race, man on the moon, foundation of ISRO, increased business and employment opportunities. This is something that had happened because a lot of new businesses were getting set up. And oftentimes these businesses were required to expand into newer territories, newer regions, and that's where it led to increased opportunities for employment also. There were better higher end professional education opportunities during this period. A lot of people would pursue higher education in India. Some of the kind of more fortunate ones would go abroad because it was possible, although it was still expensive, but they would be able to find a way. This is the generation that later, when they became adults, had two income homes, both husband and wife working. So daycare was something that became quite a necessity. These are the set of technologies that were available: personal computers, video cassette recorders or players, and Walkman. And that's why I had asked you that question earlier. Even at a household level, automation in terms of washing machine, refrigerators, microwave oven had started becoming popular for this generation. And long distance travel was, of course, possible but expensive. So this is the characteristic. These are the characteristics of the Generation X. Independent in making choices about education, about career, about marriage. A lot of the people from this generation actually chose their spouses. So they had a lot of kind of love marriages, so to say, rather than arranged marriages. The career choices they made were also based on a lot of what their peers did rather than what their parents wanted them to do. Higher education, this is a generation, most of the people from this generation would have at least a second degree, if not a post-graduation degree, because it helped them to get better opportunities. As adults, they aspired to find vocations that leverage their education, and that was important for them to be able to use what they have learned to be able to make money. Built the reputation of a can-do attitude, as I mentioned, willing to travel away from their hometowns because it gave them enhanced options. And a lot of the people from this generation would have actually settled down into other cities other than what they were born in. So not only the metro cities, but a lot of the other second rung cities had started burgeoning during this period. So if it was Bangalore or Hyderabad or Pune, Chandigarh, Kanpur, maybe, these were some of these kind of cities that had started growing. Willing to learn new things, both for personal and professional growth, was something that was important. So Gen X working styles, highly competitive, more competitive than their parents, surely, but they were vocation focused rather than opportunity focused. So they wanted to ensure that they were given due weightage for their experience as well as their education. Personal achievement was more important. They were motivated by earnings and hierarchical growths. I think perks was not something that was crucial because they were able to afford some of the perks themselves, but they were looking for challenging work. They were willing to work hard, but when they did not find getting any appreciation or acknowledgement, they would move out if they were not valued. Like face-to-face, but equally comfortable with impersonal interactions, email is something that this generation had taken up as one of the common sources of communication. If you see the workplace today, adopt technology as a means to become more proficient. So that's the that's the kind of generation X. At this stage, can we take a quick poll for the other two questions, Mahesh? This poll has two questions, so if you would want to launch it. This is a set of questions that require you to kind of answer career choices as well as decisions. Educational choices as well as career choices and decisions as you were growing up. So this has two questions. Please respond to both of them. Mahesh, you can stop the poll and show us the results.
You sure? We'll give a half a minute.
We have about 25 of 36, so about 69% people have voted. Or we can take another 10 seconds maybe.
Sure. I'll stop it 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So if you see these results, it's interesting that for a lot of the science streams, engineering or medicine were primary kind of vocational choices. Later on, they expanded to several other choices also. So if you look at 35% people saying these two. For commerce, it was predominantly either a BCom and maybe a CA articleship, but later on, it predominantly became CA and BBA and other things. And for arts, it was mostly literature, philosophy, and other such things. If you look at the other, which is searching for a job that would help earning, this was a primary driver for a lot of people in the previous generation. Explore a post-graduation in a related field is something that's coming from the generation X. Prepare and pursue is something that is probably coming from someone in generation Y. And maybe those two people who joined in, who may have been maybe from the generation Z, or may have been lucky enough to have parents which were kind of letting them do it, they wanted to explore. So this is something that is interesting, because this tells you how, if you are from the Gen X, this is how you and your parents dealt with each other. So there was some expectation that your parents had and some expectations that you have from your parents. Taking care of parents was not seen as something that was a burden. In fact, a lot of us as Generation X have actually taken care of not only our own parents, but sometimes even their parents. And it was not considered extremely burdensome for the family to take care of such as well. Even in terms of the important decisions that were done in the family, it would be an important say for the earlier generation, for Generation X, to be able to make a decision, whether it was pertaining to investment, whether it was pertaining to higher studies for their kids, and so on and so forth. So there was a mutual respect between the baby boomers and Generation X. And to a large extent, I think this is something that Generation X continues to expect in Generation Y and subsequent generations, but may face challenges when it comes to that stage. Moving on, and I'm going to go through this in a super fast speed. Generation Y, or the millennials, this is a generation that you are now going to be either parents of or managing in your offices. Born between 84 and 97 or 99, the years are not very important. Mostly single kids or one sibling, even in India for that matter. As adults, they are unsure of having kids themselves. And I have several cousins in this age group, which I can vouch for in terms of people who are wondering about this. And then, but this is a kind of classical characteristic that defined by their collaborativeness. They're willing to collaborate with people. In terms of the pestle kind of analysis, if you look at it, a lot of political and economic changes all across the world in terms of economic reforms, Berlin Wall falling down, USSR being broken, global professional and entrepreneurial opportunities, a lot of perestroika and other such economic reforms leading to globalization of workforces. World-class education was available and was accessible, which was globally recognized. So I'm talking about the MBA from IMA getting as much acknowledgement as any other Ivy League institution. High income, high expenditure, little or no savings. This is the kind of challenge of this generation. Many of them would have taken a lot of loans to get through their education, and therefore they would have to spend a lot on paying back those loans, and therefore they have little or no savings. Global products availability, comparable quality of life, always on 4G mobile data, connectivity, Wi-Fi, local and international long distance traveling within reach, and so on and so forth. So this is the typical situation that this generation has lived through. And these are some of the characteristics of Generation Y. Peer and social influence in making choices, both for education, career, marriage, and so on and so forth. Master's degree, travel abroad for higher studies, settle there, many of them. Like to be considered as experts in something. So even if they are working for you at a fairly junior level, they would expect you to treat them as experts in maybe something. For example, setting up meetings on Zoom for that matter, or creating polls on Zoom for that matter. Comfortable as team members and not independently responsible. They don't want to take up independent responsibility because right from the school days, they have always been in teams. And to a large extent, the focus on teams that we see, the excessive focus on teams that we see is a result of this kind of a thinking. They like frequent personal feedback and ways to improve strengths. They're not looking at working on their weaknesses, by the way. They are only interested in working on their strengths. So if I tell my son that, boss, you should be, so he's probably good at maths, but he has to spend a little bit of time on other subjects also so that he can improve his scoring. He says, I don't really care about other subjects. I just want to focus on maths and science. And so that's the kind of response that I get. So improving strengths is more important than working on.
Ajay, can I pause you here?
Yeah.
Would you have dared to say this to your dad? You're frozen.
Hello?
You froze for a few seconds.
No, I said I would still not dare to say like something like this to my father. and that I think is the distinctive kind of difference between the openness or the willingness of these people to respond and react, as well as B, probably the helplessness that this generation, my generation, has to be able to kind of live with it. Okay, anyway, I'm going to move on from here. Question authority, but will acknowledge it in peer recognition. So this is the working style. They want vocations that offer a purpose rather than paycheck. Not interested in earning for a lifetime. They would be happy if they are able to pay back their loans, get a decent amount of money to buy some gadgets and show off to their friends, and that would be it. Informal interactions, positional authority not always respected. So you can't tell them that you are the general manager or you are the boss's boss and therefore they have to listen to you. Nothing like that will happen. Personal development over job satisfaction. So they would quit a job if they realize that they were going to get some improvement in themselves, either so that they can be considered experts and so on and so forth. Want coaches rather than bosses. So more frequent feedback, more constructive feedback, if you will, more hand holding, not telling them their faults and so on and so forth, letting them explore themselves rather than telling them what to do, etc. Insist on work options in metros or family friendly locations. So this is a generation, if you offer them a promotion and you require them to travel to a different city, they would probably tell you, sorry sir, or a baby boomer.
Sorry, you're muted, Ajay.
No, I'm terribly sorry. I said I lost connection for just a few seconds.
Yeah.
But I'm back and I'm going to check along. So, so personal touch in the form of smileys and emoticons and so on and so forth. Gen Z is the generation born after 97 and 2013. Highly doted single kids, most of them, not yet required.
Ajay, we can't see your PPT.
Share it.
Got it.
Okay. So defined by their multitasking, and I have both my kids in this generation, and I can really tell you a lot of stories, if time would permit me, about the multitasking part as well as the other thing in terms of highly doted kids. My daughter had not traveled by public transport until she was, I think, 6 years old or something like that. I mean, you either had a personal car or someone would always pick her up in a taxi or something like that if my parents were visiting. So that's the kind of doting that I'm really referring to. And then multitasking is characteristic of my son. During the lockdown period, we've kind of distributed chores at home, and he's required to take care of cleaning up after we have had lunch and dinner. So the moment we tell him to do that, he's going to first put on his headphone, start some kind of a podcast or some music on his mobile phone, and only then he will start working. And that's the kind of typical characteristic of the people in this generation. But if you look at the, again, pestle kind of situation, you again have a lot of these. 9/11, 7/7, global terrorism is something that this generation is kind of has lived with. But a lot of changes have also happened. Consumption is not ownership. So they are happy to consume something, not necessarily need to own it. So asset-light business models have evolved, the Ubers and the Airbnbs of this world, predominantly by people and for people like him. And digital life or wearable devices, IoT is something that is the de facto standard for these people. No compulsion of a college degree for proving oneself. They are happy to kind of take up vocations such as being a DJ or being a chef or even a photographer and so on and so forth. And if you've seen Three Idiots, you would understand what I'm talking about as the Generation Y or the Generation Z. Moving on, and I'm really rushing through this because we need to understand how to manage this. But this is a characteristic, and fear of missing out or FOMO is one of the biggest characteristics that you will see in Generation Z. And therefore, they're ready to multitask, take on more, sometimes more than what they can chew, and therefore not able to deliver on them at times. But that's what they are. World is their stage for work and play. If you remember Greta Thunberg, who made quite a wave about a year and a half ago in terms of her bold speech about how the world has taken away her childhood, and the question rhetorically she kept asking is, how dare we? So that's the kind of thing that this generation is able to kind of voice out. Work style yet to be determined actually, but some of them you can figure out from the way they are at home. So I don't think this is a generation that will go on ever working. In fact, a lot of the things that we are now talking about is called a gig economy, where they will do some work on a project basis or in a short burst and would like to be paid for it. In fact, there are enough stories that I can tell you about people who hire teenagers to work for them for kind of a short project, and at the end of the period they are not able to find them because that teenager has already gone on some kind of a personal vacation, either mountaineering or surfing or somewhere. Not hesitant to question authority. Tenure and experience is no proof. Now remember the baby boomer and the Gen X, and look at the Gen Y and the Gen Z. So just because you were in a position for an X period of time does not make you someone who should be respected. That's what we are talking about here. Require assurances of personal growth and challenging work, and that's what they will keep looking for. They need instant bite-sized feedback. Bite-size is important because they cannot really grasp anything more than that can be covered in a Twitter feedback. Preferably socially recognizable. So they should get merit badges and kind of other such things that they can display on their social pages. No routine tasks that can become a chore. In fact, many of them will actually become automated. Communication is not required since it's Insta available. I'm going to quit the poll in the interest of time, Mahesh, and move on directly to the last section, which is about, now that we've understood these 4 generations, how do we actually manage them? So moving on to the last part of the session. If there are any questions at this stage, please populate them in the chat. Once we are done with this, maybe we can come back. Okay, so now we want to understand how are we going to manage these generational divides. So I have looked at various aspects of these management or managing of the various people, and there are 9 or 10 different criteria that I have looked at from how these 4 generations are different, and therefore what would it take to manage them. So let's take a look at them one by one. In terms of longevity in an organization, a baby boomer would work in the same organization easily upwards of 15 years. In fact, long service awards were given to baby boomers who had worked 20 plus years or 25 plus years. And so that's a typical longevity in the organization for the baby boomer. In terms of the work ethic, this is a generation that was workaholic, in the sense that they would not worry whether it was day or night, or whether it was working days or off days. They would continue to work because it helped them to stay kind of in the job as well as be able to earn more. So overtimes was quite a big thing for the baby boomer era. And you could actually get a lot of workers to work even 2 shifts at time to be able to get your work done. So this is the work ethic that we are talking about. This is a generation that liked to be led by other generation or previous generations or others in general who were authoritarian. They respected that they had the authority. In many cases, the authority came from a position or experience or the fact that you had some power over these people. Thought leadership was something that was also very highly valued. someone who could think differently or bring a larger perspective was always someone who could be considered as a leader. This is influenced by experts with evidence and insight. So they would want people to say that they are experts in something before they would believe them in terms of what they want to say. So if I were to come and say that I am so and so, they would say, okay, this guy is a PhD from IIT Bombay, and so maybe he has some kind of evidence for that. Motivations, typically titles, financial rewards were the typical motivations, and this is something that was used by many organizations in a way to kind of motivate such people also. There are a few other characteristics which we'll see in the second slide, but let's look at the Generation X now. We are talking of a tenure of between 5 to 7 years in an organization. In fact, just as in marriage, there is a 7-year itch. Even in the case of working, there is a 7-year itch for Generation X. And a lot of people were willing to move out because they realized that they were stagnating in their organization unless they were already promoted or they were already in some kind of a progression in the organization. Work ethic, highly independent, self-reliant, adaptable, and speak their mind. So this is a generation who are willing to take up a responsibility completely independently. So they did not want someone to kind of hover over them and look at themselves, look at them doing the work. They would be happy taking a brief from their managers or their bosses and going away and doing things on their own. Highly self-reliant, they would go back to their bosses and say, "Ye nahi hua, wo nahi hua." So that's the kind of thing. Adaptable. Technology had evolved drastically during this generation, and so they were continuously adapting to their technologies as well. Speaking one's mind, a lot of people, because they were confident that they had the kind of expertise, were willing to say what they wanted to say rather than keep quiet. What is the leader they like? Action-oriented and coordinating kind of a characteristic. So someone who himself, he or she himself was highly kind of and action-oriented was someone that was cherished as a leader. Highly influenced by hands-on practitioners. So they would be, they would like someone who could show them that this is how it could be done. Not tell them how it could be done, but actually show them how things could be done. What were the motivations? Many of them were kind of looking at entrepreneurial freedom, and even those who are working in organizations, they would expect this freedom in the form of the ability to do things on their own rather than be told what needs to be done. Work-life balance was important for them because this is a generation that had moved out of the extended families and had smaller families, and therefore wanted to spend a lot of time with the family. Both husband and wife were working, and therefore they did not have enough time other than the kind of little time that they had after work. So they wanted to strike a balance between this work life. Coming to Generation Y, and remember, we've moved from years to months, and therefore you would know what would be expected coming up later. Multitasker, do it all, involved, goal oriented. This is the kind of work ethic that this generation demonstrates. So they want to do everything, they want to do it themselves. They are highly involved when they're doing it, but when they're not doing it, if you ask them something, they will say, okay, I'll have to refer to something. Led by, these are the people who like empowering bosses, who let them do things on their own, who want to collaborate with them rather than coordinate or supervise them. They are influenced by peers who can share their experiences. So even if they are in a training session, they would rather get other people who've been there, done that, to share their experiences for them to be able to take some lessons. What are the motivations? I think making sense of what is happening around them and what is happening with them is something that drives them. Highly goal oriented, so they want to be somewhere at a certain point, in their life, and so on and so forth. Coming to Generation Z or Generation Z, the question of longevity is a big question because they are saying that I'm here for a gig, which means that give me a project, let me handle it my way, I will deliver the report to you, and that's the end of the story. Their work ethic is yet to be discovered because they still have to take on positions in the organization, but they like to be led by people who are inspirational. They want to hear stories from people who have achieved some greatness. So they would rather hear from big business barons about their experiences rather than college professors who would tell them concepts. They would want to be people who would want to be influenced by people who are like them. So user-generated forums or peer forums is something that they would like. Security and stability is more important, and they want more from life. Security and stability needs to be explained here because this is a generation that is already fairly secure because they haven't started exploring, they haven't moved out of the house. A lot of the kids in this generation are still staying with their parents, and therefore the ability to not ruffle this is something that is important for this generation. Definitely my last slide, and thank you so much for patiently listening to me. In terms of what the generations value, here is a look at these four generations. What do they value? Baby boomers value experience, they value equality, sensitivity to time. Mahesh and I were just discussing about this before we started the session today. Being trustworthy is something that they are highly kind of sold on. And personal growth is very important to the baby boomer. In terms of communication style, they want more in-person communication. Phone or email is acceptable now because they have to do it, but I think the voice, tone, and language is fairly guarded on both these, particularly in the email. Feedback, I think they were happy once a year, so an appraisal system that allowed for an interaction with the boss once a year was more than enough for classroom session where someone who with an expertise would come and tell them the concepts. The training focus was more on technical data and evidence. In terms of Generation X, I think independence and flexibility or adaptiveness is what they value the most. The genuine interest in them is something that is really valuable for them. Practical and result-driven kind of activity feedback is something that they would really value if you were managing the Generation X. Email or text was something that was is their communication style. At times they would even be irreverent, but in most cases they would be reverent. So you would find a Mr. So-and-so and thanking you in an email sent by you by a Generation X, rarely hello Bob kind of an email coming from a Generation X. In terms of feedback, I think a monthly feedback or maybe once in 3 months feedback is something that they would definitely like because it would help them to get better and improve rather than wait for 1 year. In terms of our learning environment, more roundtable discussions than a one-to-many kind of a discussion is what this generation values. In terms of training focus, they are looking at more practical case studies and applications rather than concepts because they can quickly figure out these concepts, but when it comes to applying them, they need to understand what are the pitfalls through which things might fall. As far as Generation Y is concerned, I think they value entitlement, but they are highly civic-minded, confident, innovativeness, diversity is something that they would really value. So they would not have any hesitation to have multicultural, multiracial teams working together, being headed by someone from a completely different kind of nation and so on and so forth. Social messaging, text messaging, real-time one-to-many messaging is what this generation is all about. I think WhatsApp is the common kind of generation communication for this generation. The feedback for them has to be on demand. So they want to know as and when they are looking for feedback, how they are doing and what they could do to improve. Their learning environment style is more cafe style, where people come in together, everyone brings in their own expertise, and then they kind of share. They want other sources of learning in the form of music, drama, activity-based learning, and so on and so forth. Training focus is more emotional stories and want to be a more participative nature than kind of a lecture of sorts. In terms of Generation Z, there are a lot of things that yet to be discovered, but they value exposure, they value visibility, they value being taken seriously, and they value other when they are valued for their independent views. And this is something that should be important if and when you are going to manage these people. In terms of their communication styles, I think text and any kind of messaging is completely out. Video calls, all kinds of video-based interactions are important. Handheld devices are obviously the source of any of this. Feedback is continuous and social. In fact, there is a term called sonar. So they are constantly pinging others for feedback, and that's something that they want to get the feedback on. So they buy a new dress and they put it up on their social feed, and they want instant likes and comments on that dress. When they don't, they feel as if the world has come to an end. In terms of learning environment, they're looking at more lounge style. Lounge style meaning not necessarily a learning environment, but kind of hanging out with friends and hanging out with other people who might give them something to think about. Multi-stimuli in terms of immersion, role play, simulations are some of the evolving learning environments that they find extremely useful. All of them have played video games and other such things, and therefore this is something that they like when they are used for learning also. Bite-sized, multimodal, and interactive is the nature of the training inputs that they are most likely to respond to. If you are going to give them a one-day session on something, they are going to switch off. But if you send them 15 videos or 5-minute videos, 20 such videos, I think they'll be happy to consume it, because they can do it when they want and where they want. So that's the kind of overall management of the generational divides. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but if there are any questions at this stage, I'll be happy to take them, and I'll be able to support some of the things that we have just said using some examples, if that's what
Yes,
we want.
Ajay,